All right, folks, welcome back. Our panelists are making their way to the platform. And let's let the Congressman sit here on the end. There's a reason for that. All right. All right, welcome back. Everybody liked the first session? All right, good. This part of the program will not disappoint. We have an all-star lineup here. I'd like to introduce them briefly. I'm not going to read the entire bios unless you all, have some ego issue. I'll read the entire thing. Mark Wingfield is our moderator today. Mark's here on the end. He's the executive director and publisher of Baptist News Global. He's a journalist, an associate pastor in Dallas, Texas, and I don't know, anything else we need to know about you? He's a friend of Crescent Hills, as are so many of you now. Sam Marcosson, raise your hand. One of our friends, Sam, is a professor of law at Brandeis Law School. He's a constitutional law scholar, served on the appellate staff of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and he teaches constitutional law, civil rights, criminal law, and procedure. Thank you, Sam. Let's see. State Senator Cassie Chambers Armstrong. She's a law professor, graduated from Harvard with her JD, Yale with a master's in public health. Is that correct? Yeah, with I didn't know what MPH was. I didn't know if that was speeding or what that was anyway. London School of Economics with an MSc, and I don't know what that is.
Master's in the Science of Government.
So, you can see we've got some high achievers up here on the platform. Phillip Shepard, Judge Shepard, is a circuit court judge out of Franklin County. He has ruled on a number of issues arising between the legislature, the Attorney General's office, cities and counties all across the state. He's a graduate of Asbury and the UK College of Law. He often rules on open records cases in the Commonwealth. Judge Shepard, thank you for being here. Morgan McGarvey, 3rd District Congressman from Kentucky, has agreed to join us. I think everybody knows about Congressman McGarvey. Graduated from Manual High School, BA in journalism from the University of Missouri, JD from UK. Lives here in Louisville. He is home for the weekend, I think just for the weekend. It is election season. Congressman is going to have to bug out a little bit early, but he'd still like for you all to vote for him. Dr. Louis Brogdan messaged me last night, and he had a family emergency. I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, we'll pray for Dr. Brogdan and his family. In his stead is Erica Whitaker, Reverend Erica Whitaker, who is his colleague at BSK Seminary, Associate Director of the Institute for Black Church Studies, yes, and a pastor in...
I'm out in Mumfordville now.
Mumfordville,
yeah.
I don't know where that is. Anyway, she's a pastor in Mumfordville, and she also is one of Dr. Gushie's PhD students, as you learned earlier, and she teaches at U of L with Professor Marcosson.
I teach at Simmons.
I'm sorry, she teaches at Simmons.
It's a little different than U of L.
Yeah, she teaches at Simmons. Anyway, thank you for coming back for this part of the program. I'll turn it over to Mark Wingfield.
All right, thanks so much, and it's a delight to be here. And For those who don't know, we're live streaming all of the events today on B&G's Facebook page. We had about 350 people in and out of our stream during the last session, and I'm sure we'll have more here. All of this will be archived on our B&G Baptist News Global Facebook page, and then we'll be reducing this down to some other video elements as well. So there is a national audience here today for this, as well as those of us in the room. And just by way of introduction, I have not lived in Kentucky for 25 years, but I did. My wife and I lived here in Louisville for 8 fabulous years. Our boys were born at Norton Hospital here, and we had just a marvelous time in Kentucky, and we probably would still be here if the Kentucky Baptist Convention hadn't gone so far to the right. But that's another story that's related to this. So the other full disclaimer here is that Erica, almost Dr. Whitaker, is a very good friend, and we've known each other a long, long time, worked together in the past. And Dr. Gushee is one of our columnists at B&G as well. You can find a lot of his work there. Dr. Gushee mentioned in his comments earlier the little seminary around the corner here. And I was having a conversation last week with a friend who is a Southern Baptist who is very much more conservative than me, but not as conservative as that place. And he made the comment that in the view of the leadership of the seminary, if you are not always steering more to the right, you are drifting to the left. If you're not always steering more to the right, you are drifting to the left. And my response to that was, well, that assumes that being on the right is the correct place to be. And I'm wondering, in this conversation about democracy, there is, it seems to me, baked into the equation, this notion among some folks that the conservative position is the default position that we begin with. And so I'd like to ask each of you, as you introduce yourselves, if you'd like to say just a brief word of welcome, but let's start with this question as we go through. This is the softball round, okay? Let's start here and just go down the line.
Thanks a lot. Well,
Yeah.
you know, I think that we are living in perilous times in terms of having genuine, open, honest discussion of these important civic issues that are facing us as a country today. So, you know, I'm not quite sure how we bridge that gap, but I think discussions like this are a good place to start. So I'm happy to be a part of the discussion and look forward to exchanging ideas with you all here today.
Thanks again for having me. I'm Cassie Chambers Armstrong. Your question was interesting to me because, like Congressman McGarvey, I'm someone who sits on the left side of the aisle in
Yes.
a political context. I'm elected as a Democrat to serve in our Kentucky General Assembly. I also teach at the law school with Professor Marcosson. And so what resonated with me about your sort of opening statement, this idea of drifting to the left, what I actually see in the General Assembly these days is that we are drifting constantly towards the right. We actually did have a very stable understanding of our separation between church and state and the way our Constitution protected that for a number of decades. And what we're seeing now is that begin to be eroded and chipped away over time. And every day in the General Assembly, I see how state legislatures are stepping in to push that boundary even further. And every time there's a crack, to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation and chatting about that with y'all today.
Thank you.
Well, you all heard me talk for an hour and 20 minutes. I'll try to be brief in this panel, but the story that I was telling was of an aggrieved traditionalist Christian conservative population that has bought that narrative that the country has drifted to the left or has been pulled headlong to the left by the woke liberals, and that it needs to be wrestled back to the right, which they understand indeed to be the default position. The pre-19, give a name, a year, pre-1950, pre-1940, pre-1920 default when America was great and everybody was Christian and the right people were in charge. And so the part of the mindset is, it's almost like you can never be too far right. There are no boundaries on the right. If you want to remake America's church-state arrangements, that's fine, because anything that takes you to the right is good. Anything that takes you to the left is bad, and that is, I think, a very dangerous place to be.
Agreed.
Well, I'll be the slight voice of dissent on this, I think. And that is to say, that doesn't bother me so much. We all have a starting point in which we say, the other side, or the people who disagree with me, are wrong. That it's how they disagree that's the problem. It's if someone disagrees and says, we're going to alienate you from the political culture, we're going to take away your rights, we're going to depart from democratic means. That's the problem in the trying to correct for the drift you perceive. If somebody says, look, I think the country's in the wrong direction, I want to pull it to the right, or if they say I want to pull my church to the right, or in any direction, I don't have any objection to that. What I do have an objection to is to say those who will disagree with me are not just wrong, but to be opposed in such a way that their rights are taken away, or that we do it by non-democratic means, which I think was what the conversation was about. So disagree all you want. I think that's glorious, but the danger is not in the disagreement, it's in the how, for me.
Good.
You would make a great Baptist pastor. At least at a business meeting.
My Jewish mother would be very upset to hear that.
Well, I'm clearly not Dr. Brogdan. I identify as a white woman. But it's good to be here. I'll put on my pastor hat for this question. I've been pastoring churches for over a decade now, and was in a Baptist church here, and now I'm at a Presbyterian church full of ex-Catholics and ex-Baptists, which is really fun in Mumfordville. And the conversation around disagreement is actually really pivotal, especially in places where you want democracy to thrive. And in a really localized level, like a church or congregation or community, you want democracy to really thrive. And oftentimes, since I lean towards the left, I hear from people who lean towards the right or are on the right saying that you never make space for my voice, I feel alienated. And I'm like, well, okay, well, that's your experience, so I don't want to dismiss that. But I want to be mindful about how do we create space for all voices, for the dissenting voices, especially coming out of a Baptist tradition. And so what I offer is very pragmatic, is how do we invite people not to hold their position, but to take a posture. And to hold your position means that you can either be right or wrong in either direction, but to take a posture actually creates an openness to learn from the other. And that has served me really well as a pastor and as a professor, too.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Morgan McGarvey, represent Louisville in Congress in Washington. Just a few quick thoughts. One, I've served on a lot of panels with Professor Marcosson, and I love him dearly. It's the first time I've ever heard you should be a Baptist preacher. And it certainly is a new mindset for this Presbyterian's version of being a Baptist. So that'd be fun to watch. But I do agree with the idea of dissent, because when I think about Christian nationalism and its quote-unquote conservatism, what I think of is it's an anti-democratic political ideology that is based on the idea that Americans should be a conservative Christian nation with laws based on the Bible. It is exclusive. It is getting rid of equality. It is hostile to the ideas of democracy. And then to your question, the only thing I would add is, as they say, going toward conservative, my question is, which conservative? Because let's look at this from a sort of political ideology standpoint, where for a long time being a don't tax and don't spend conservative, completely valid political philosophy, but one rooted in a philosophy that was juxtaposed to a raise revenue and spend more progressive or liberal person, and then how you sort out those disagreements created democracy. And you know, the way I say it is, whenever you go to a kid's soccer game, or you're in an office place, or you're somewhere where you don't want to offend anybody, what do you hear people always say when you talk about politics? A lot of people will say, I'm socially liberal, fiscally conservative, which is almost a new way of saying I'm not crazy. And I think the Christian nationalists are the exact opposite. They are fiscally liberal and socially conservative. They will spend every red-hot cent they can get their hands on to enact their agenda, which is hostile to democracy. And so I think when we talk about which way they're steering to the right, not just how they're steering to the right, how they're steering away from what I would call the traditional right and what impact that has on politics.
Okay, that's the money line so far. Yeah, excellent, beautiful. So I promise not to pick on the seminary over the hill too much today, but it's a good foil for some of this because it embodies so much of what we want to talk about in this. This notion of dissent and the difficulty we have disagreeing today has so many religious overtones now because it's just been made religious because of the factors that Dr. Gushie rehearsed those. I don't need to cite them. So within the past week, there have been 3 or more major groups that have come out with a focus on supporting Kamala Harris in her presidential bid. One is called Christians for Kamala. Another is called Evangelicals for Harris. And there's an LDS group that's LDS for Harris, I think is what it's called as well. 3 different kind of groups. Of one of these, the Evangelicals for Harris group, Denny Burke, who is a professor here and also the head of a group called the Center for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, said that anyone who's an evangelical is supporting Kamala Harris is denying the gospel itself. That this is another way of saying what I've been told for years: how can you be a Democrat? How can you be a Christian and be a Democrat, right? And this becomes such a religio-partisan thing, and we can take this in whatever order y'all want to, whatever the Spirit leads here, just pop up with this. How have we gotten to this point where your politics determines your religion, or your religion determines your politics, in such a way that everyone else is of Satan?
Well, I'll jump in. I think.
Preach.
Good.
I think those of us on the left should take some, maybe 10% of the responsibility for that.
Okay.
Because I think we have failed to think creatively and certainly effectively about how to speak to those communities and members of those communities so they will not feel like their home is only in the political right. The concerns about changes in culture, the drift of society, I think there could have been ways, and maybe there still are, to speak to those concerns in a way that is sympathetic to the concerns while trying to not give in to the baser impulses, the bigotry, the intolerance. And sometimes people want to feel heard and respected in their concerns that animate their lives. The faith that, and for some people, is a matter of good faith and not just hatred and not just animus. So, I wish if we could turn back the clock, that we would have had more conversations on the left about how to deal with, in a constructive way, those on the cultural right. And I'm not saying that we deserve most of the responsibility for that at all, but it's always helpful to think about ways we can do better from our side rather than just criticizing the others.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, and I think about this a lot as a person of faith. I identify as Christian. I'm raising my children in the Christian faith. And I get a lot of that too. How can you be a Democrat and be a Christian? And one thing that I think there's space for in our debate is to point out the way that some of the policies that are being championed by the new extreme right really aren't rooted in Christianity or Christian values. And so I remember this past year, whenever the General Assembly passed House Bill 5, this omnibus crime legislation, that literally made it a crime for someone to be unhoused, to not have shelter. If a police officer walked up to someone and said, you can't be on the sidewalk, and they said, I have nowhere to go, they could take them to jail, and we've seen that there have been dozens of people cited for that in the city of Louisville since that law went into effect. And that is not what my faith teaches me about how we are to treat people who are struggling in our community. That's not what I teach my children, about how to treat people who are struggling in our community. And so one thing that I try to do is to authentically, when it is called for in the moment, to talk about my faith values and talk about my understanding of my religion, and just to remind people that there are different ways to understand what on the outside might look like a shared faith, and that it leads to different policy implications.
Yeah, beautiful. Good.
You can see Cassie is not a childless cat lady, so. But I would say, in following up on this, that one of the big obstacles, I think, to having a real honest discussion of these issues and to engaging in the kind of civic dialogue that we need to make democracy healthy is that, it reminds me, and I'm getting in beyond my area of expertise with Professor Marcosson and Professor Armstrong here, but one of the big constitutional cases of the mid-20th century was the flag salute cases, and one of those was authored by Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was a great civil libertarian and became a great Supreme Court justice. The story is told that there was a great criticism of his decision, which upheld a local school board's policy of requiring flag salutes. And many of his friends on the left criticized him for that decision, and one of the criticisms was that that the ruling was purely symbolic, and Frankfurter's response to that was, "We live by symbols," and I think that's very true. We do live by symbols, and in this debate, I think we suffer from the fact that. Really, I think that the people on the right in our political in our political world have kind of expropriated the symbols of faith and family and patriotism, and I think people on the left have been generally uncomfortable about talking about those things and about claiming the symbols that are important to so many people in their daily lives. So I think that's an area where, things need to change if we're going to really overcome, this bridge between the left and the right and to keep democracy healthy. So.
Thank you. I'll just insert a self-promoting plug here. I wrote a really excellent piece around the 4th of July, humbly, I say, about how we on the left need to reclaim patriotism. And I think this is the very idea. So let's get back to the question here.
Yeah, so... One, I'm a childless dog lady, so it's okay.
Childless dog lady, yes.
You mentioned symbols, and when we talk about how does religion and politics, play together, and how have they historically done this? This is part of my research in a chapter that I still owe Dr. Gushy, specifically on white supremacy and symbols. And white Jesus iconography is a really important symbol that shows up in all of our spaces, not just in religious spaces, in liberal spaces, in conservative spaces. And white Jesus iconography is really a deeply seated symbol of white supremacy. And it's all over. And what does that symbol represent? Well, it represents who is allowed to be in power. And earlier during the Q&A time, there was a question about visually, what does Kamala Harris represent, and Donald Trump, Lord have mercy.
He did have a college.
Did he have a college?
I don't think they give out degrees on what he's got a doctorate
Oh my gosh, I just
in.
gave an honorary doctorate to the wrong person. But But visually, this is really, really challenging for our society. Because when a society that oftentimes leans into Christian nationalism, that then upholds a patriarchal system, that symbol represents God, who is then mirrored in the image of a white male body, this becomes very challenging even for liberals, even in the African American communities that are oftentimes rooted in patriarchal, in white theology. How do we understand having an African American female president being the potential symbol of power in our country? This is very, very difficult. And if we don't understand the religious propaganda that began during the Crusades of white Jesus and white biblical iconography that then upheld that. I'm lecturing on this chapter that I will get to you eventually. It is very important how we approach what is seen and not seen in these spaces. I'm done.
Congressman?
Wow, okay. It's hard to follow that up, especially when I was going to go back to what you all were talking about, and I'll try to abstain from talking about some of the case law. There's a great joke they tell in law school. They say, what do you call a law student who's an A student? Professor. A B student, Your Honor. A C student, lawyer. A D student, Congressman. So I'm going to go back to the politics here. And the idea of Democrats as Christians versus Republicans as Christians. And I thought it was really interesting what Professor Marcosson and Professor Senator Armstrong and Judge Shepard all said. And of course, I think of this as a person of faith. And as a Democrat and a Christian, as someone who's a member at Highland Pres, who sent all three of our kids through the weekday school at Highland Pres, I look at this and say, almost, how could you not be a Christian, or the Christian values as a Democrat, right? The Christian values, and you look at how those are so reflected in taking care of the least of these, and in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and then of course in chapter 7 when he says, he who hears my words and acts on these, the idea that we actually do to help others is so important. And I think because there is that faith, whether being a Christian in the Democratic Party or not a Christian in the Democratic Party, that idea that we are all in this together of helping each other out has led us in some ways to forget that there's someone else on the field. And I think when we look at the conservative side of this, we have to recognize that particularly in Christian nationalism, this is not a grassroots movement. I think this is very much a top-down structure. And we are not going to church or going in spaces and demonizing those on the right. And I think if you go to even churches in Kentucky right now, and you were to sit in the pews on a Sunday, you would hear Democrats be demonized. You would hear that people say things, and you've probably heard in private conversations at least, people saying things about Democrats. And we have never fought back against that. And Judge, to your idea that we haven't talked about this enough. But it is an attack, and it's intentional. And so I think we have to work in that frame of mind too, that there are ground troops to this movement, but it is very much led from the top. And an example I would give you right now, as you look in the 2024 elections, is Project 2025. This is heavily influenced by the idea of Christian nationalism and what they want to do to government and how they want to do it. And so, again, that idea that it's a top-down structure, they are being intentional when we have not been as intentional, and I think we failed to recognize some of what an opponent is actually doing.
I'll just add this. The scholarship shows me that the identification of Christianity with a conservative political ideology in the U.S. at least goes back to the social gospel years of the early 20th century. Being anti-progressive movement, anti-New Deal, anti-Great Society. So a lot of this was economic, where some of the partnership developed between the libertarian, conservative, small government, small taxes it was an effort to keep the money in the hands that it was already in. So you can see that in the anti-FDR, anti-progressive, anti-LBJ, anti-Great Society. But then you have the intentional marriage of conservative white Christianity with the Republican Party, beginning with which I talked about earlier, beginning with the Moral Majority and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and such. Now, my understanding is that it was originally more of a marriage of convenience, like, hey, Reagan, we'll give you our people if you give us abortion or opposition to abortion and you give us family values language. But over the decades, it became more of an identity fusion, so that Republican equaled Christian and Christian equaled Republican. The Democrats, on the whole, did not do well at pushing back. There were efforts, like the Obama campaign in 2008, intentionally attempted to speak faith language and to reach out to faith leaders. Hillary Clinton didn't do as well on that in 2016, which is, I think, one of the reasons why she lost. Joe Biden has had a faith operation. It was relatively weak compared to the Obama operation in 2008. Also, the Democratic coalition has a lot of secular folks in it. And I think there's been a concern that if you hit the religious language too hard, you're going to alienate the secular part of the Democratic base, or the non-Christian part. And so sometimes values language gets pretty thin. It can be kind of technocratic, kind of, we're for this policy for this reason. And the reason we're for this is because we don't say, right? We care about the dignity of every person, or we want every child to have a chance to flourish, or we believe that all people are made in the image of God. I strongly think that Democrats who believe that should speak that language. And otherwise, the field is left to the other version of religion and politics, which I think is pretty toxic.
Yeah. Did you have something to say? No. So I want to combine two ideas into one question here, because they're sort of related, and it gets to some of the things y'all are talking about as well. What many of us would say is that this Christian nationalism movement and those related, adjacent to it, are not concerned about the common good. They're concerned about their own good. What's best for them, not what's best for my neighbor, right? So we have a pastor like John MacArthur in Los Angeles, Calvinist, very conservative, who during the pandemic refuses to shut down his church because the government can't tell him what to do. It's about me and my right to worship, not about you and your right to be free of COVID. And they had an outbreak and all that. But he sued the Los Angeles County and the state of California and won. I mean, they had to pay him because he refused to close his, that's where we are. But the place we see this, I think most often now, is in debates about public education. Such a huge issue. So I was listening this past week one day on the radio to a BBC World Service broadcast, and they were interviewing folks in Arizona where there is a universal, completely flexible school voucher bill that's been passed, that's in effect. And so you, if I understand it correctly, you can use the government money to send your kid with a voucher to any school, religious or not. This is what people in Texas, our governor's been trying to do this, has held our legislature captive on this, and he's not succeeded yet because, ironically, it's the rural Republicans who are pushing back on this. But they interviewed this woman who was an evangelical mom, and her statement haunted me. She said, "It is my obligation to indoctrinate my children in my faith. It is my obligation to indoctrinate my children in my faith." And now she said she can do that through her voucher going to a private evangelical school, and the taxpayers are doing that. This is the heart of what part of this debate is about, right? It's public education, it's tax money, it's the law, it's parenting, right? To me, this is like the perfect cauldron of exemplifying this. And I'm wondering if some of y'all would talk about that intersection, however you want to. Yeah.
So before I knew that Professor Marcosson was going to be on the panel today, I thought I was going to be responsible for knowing a lot of constitutional law, so I read Supreme Court cases this morning. And it was a very exciting morning. I believe it is Breminger. Is that the name of the, what is it? Bremerton, sorry, it's still not stuck in my head. That was the most recent Supreme Court case that dealt with the separation of church and state in public schools, and I think it's very related to...
The praying football coach.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, I'd sort of heard about the case, and I'd seen that the General Assembly passed a law that went right up to what the Supreme Court had said was permissible and pushed past it. The way I'd heard it characterized when people were talking about it is it was a case about private prayer on a football field, and the Supreme Court said that seems constitutional, and I was like, well, we have had the Constitution that protects private religious expression in public schools and all of that. Reading the facts today, it was actually quite different. It was a football coach who had been inviting his players as well as opposing players immediately upon the conclusion of the game to engage in a very public, very performative religious expression in the middle of a sort of school event, which is something for a number of years, and Professor Marcosson will correct me if I'm wrong, was clearly understood to be unconstitutional. The question was, would a reasonable observer watching this conclude that the government had endorsed the religious beliefs or the religious expression? And I think most people looking at something like that, and again, Professor Marcosson is the real expert here, would probably say, yes, that looks like the government is endorsing that religious expression. And what we saw in the Supreme Court case is the Supreme Court overruled the precedent, changed the rules, recharacterized this very public, very performative, very using government resources by government employees as something that was private and within the bounds of the Constitution. And the reason that matters, it's a really great dissent if anyone is looking to spend your morning like I did today. There's a great dissent that basically talked about the importance of separation of church and state in public schools in particular, because they said America is founded on this idea that you can be of any religion, you can be of no religion, and you have just as much of a claim to our democracy and to America and to participate. And our schools are especially important because they are the way that we give people a path to participating in that democracy. They are the way that we create futures for folks. And so it's particularly important that to our children, who are especially susceptible to messages and to coercion, that we really make sure that we are saying it doesn't matter if you have whatever faith or no faith at all, you are still entitled to all of the fruits of our democracy and to participate fully. And so I really worry about, as we begin to erode that, what that means for our children and for how our children come to understand what it means to be an American and how they view themselves in this wonderful multi-faith democracy that we all exist in.
Thank you. Yeah.
Obviously, I agree with Cassie. It's a very, you can on the surface, you can scratch Christian nationalism on the surface and tell immediately it violates the principles of the separation of church and state, upon which not only this country were founded, but literally people coming over here fleeing religious persecution, noting the importance, wanting to have a separation of church and state. And I think that even plays into what you were talking about, Dr. Gushee, where Democrats do talk in more secular terms. We believe in a separation of church and state. And even though I am certainly a Christian, I want you to be able to practice whatever religion you want to, whether that is practicing a religion or actively not practicing a religion, because that is the environment we want. And we want that inclusive environment, and we're not trying to offend anyone in that process. And I think if you start talking to some of the Christian nationalists, what they will tell you is, oh yeah, we just got it wrong. The country shouldn't have a separation of church and state. That's not what was intended to happen. And that they want very much this Christian government. And this is not something, we're sitting here talking about it today like it's new. It is not new. And in fact, it has been creeping in for years and years and years. And they have been willing to accept that sort of mission creep of passing things that might seem innocuous at first, like having "In God We Trust" on a license plate in Kentucky. And then now you look in Oklahoma, where the state superintendent for Oklahoma schools is mandating that there's a Bible for every student in every classroom and that they be taught the Bible. And he says, if you say I'm doing this because I'm a Christian nationalist, it's because I am. Right? And so I think that is a little bit of what we're up against, again, is this anti-democratic idea of Christian nationalism, it does violate the separation of church and state, which is the goal, I think.
Well said. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First, I think that when we're talking about separation of church and state, there's nothing at all to me wrong with this mother saying, I consider it my duty to indoctrinate my child. It's when she uses the public schools or a legislature empowers her to use public dollars to indoctrinate her child. I think parents all over try to instruct their children in the religious faith and tradition that they believe in. Nothing wrong with that, as far as I'm concerned. But when you start using the mechanism and resources of the state, now we have a problem, a big problem. And similarly, I think the more foundational question is the other part of your question that you asked about the pastor who showed no concern whatsoever for the rest of the community when it came to COVID. And courts validated that, including the U.S. Supreme Court, using some very specious reasoning, which I won't get into the details of because time is fleeting. But if we are only concerned with, I think what it reflects is a sensibility that we're only concerned, from their point of view, with our own, with the people who are in our congregation, who we think the religious mission of being able to have our worship services as we want to have them is all that counts. And the rest of the community are the others. And Dr. Gushee talked about how part of this whole problem is that it defines people who are outside of recognized Christian right nationalism as an other who can be disregarded, who can be disrespected, and who can be harmed. And in this very tangible way during COVID is, I think, an unusual but interesting example of that.
I use the language of covenant to talk about the possibility of the idea that we all understand everybody in the community to be in covenant with us. And so if that would include people of religious minorities and no religion. And so I would think, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, along with the general idea of covenant would be, I must be just as concerned about that kid who is the only one in the class who does not share the majority Christian view as I would be about my own child. And so I don't want that person to be miserable in school because they are having the entire authority structure bring a majoritarian religion onto them that is not theirs. That's neighbor love. It's also constitutional, historically. Yeah. I also talked in my lecture about, I think a lot of Christian conservative angst is about children. Let's just name children at the center of this. What's happening to our children? What's going to happen to our children? It is easy to gin up panic about children because everybody loves their children and their grandchildren, right? What's happening to our children? So I talked about how there was a strategy initially of, okay, if we don't like what the public schools are going to do, we'll just withdraw our kids into home schools or Christian schools and we'll pay for it ourselves. You may not love that people do that, but you can see why that would be their right to do that. That's an enclave strategy or a withdrawal strategy. It's a very different strategy to say, you know what, we might have the votes to just turn the public schools into Christian schools because we have the votes. If 80% of the people in Oklahoma are for it, because we have the majority, then by golly, we might just be able to get away with it and the Constitution, be darned, right? So it's a very different strategy to move from a withdrawal strategy to a taking over strategy and trampling over the constitutional boundary lines in the process. And that, I think, is what we're seeing, and that's a different thing, and that has to be protested.
Yeah. I would follow up on that by saying, I've been waiting. One of the controversies over church and state over the years has been state legislation or local school boards that have required the posting of the Ten Commandments in school districts. And that was a state law in Kentucky that about 40 years ago, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And now I think we're seeing that effort revived in some other states, but I'm sure it will be revived in Kentucky. So I just want to make one little, suggestion to Senator Chambers Armstrong, that when that bill comes to the floor, I would suggest, why don't you do a floor amendment along the line that David just suggested here and say, instead of the 10 Commandments, let's post this, love your neighbor.
Amen.
I do think we need to name that the U.S., particularly since the 18th century, public schools really have only been for white children. And really up until the past several decades, when that has infringed upon it, then we've really brought it to the forefront of that. But historically, public schools have not been in favor of minority children. And I think that is really important to name, particularly following the American Revolution, when public schools were actually a branch of church life. And enslaved children were sent there to be indoctrinated into Christianity. And that's part of our history that oftentimes does get repeated. And schools were created to send Native American children or indigenous children to as well in a form of Christian indoctrination. So there is this historical nature of Christianity infringing upon religious liberty when it comes to our children in public schools. Just wanted to name that.
Well said. And this is, as you know from Texas, this is not true just of black kids, but of Hispanic kids who were told it didn't matter whether they showed up to school or not, because they were never going to amount to anything, right?
Yeah, and I think just in reaction to some of the things that have been said, we have not really covered the not so thinly veiled racism of the Christian nationalist movement right now. And when you talk about schools in particular, here in Louisville, we very much see that playing out, even with a ballot initiative up this November that would direct public dollars towards religious institutions. And if you think that the people who want that in Louisville want those schools to be integrated, I'd love to have a conversation with you after this. And so I think that very much plays into what's happening. But, Dr. Gushee, you also said something about the covenant, the idea of covenant. And what I see from a lot of the Christian nationalists in particular is that their idea of covenant is we're right and you're wrong. And therefore, we're going to do what's right, and hopefully you come along. And I was listening to an All Things Considered on NPR, and it was a reporter talking to one of the leaders in the Christian nationalist movement. And the Christian nationalist leader was saying, we have to have Christian nationalists take over our government. It is the world's moral code. It is the only way to live. And the reporter pushed back. He said, well, I'm curious about this. How do you do that? He says, we have to elect only leaders who have that worldview. And the reporter basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, the reporter said, whoa, that worries me a little bit. I'm Jewish. And how is my world going to look in this? And he said, well, you've lived in a Christian nation all your life so far, so things seem to be working out pretty well. And the reporter said, well, you just told me I shouldn't run for office. And he said, yes, because your view of the world is wrong. And what I think you're seeing now is they're saying the quiet part out loud. And so it's, when you look at the churches, when you look at the schools, when you look at the COVID stuff, it is the covenant of we're right, we're going to do whatever we think is right, and we're going to have a government that imposes that on every single other person, which is why I guess as the federal guy up here, I keep going back to the anti-democratic nature, anti-democracy nature of Christian nationalism and what it means for all of us.
Okay, you could be a Baptist preacher too. We're going to just hand out licenses today. Did you want to add to that?
Thanks. You should come,
Okay,
you should come to our church.
This is
Marcosson,
fantastic,
McGarvey.
y'all. I'm going to call out what I have labeled the evangelical legal industrial complex. And over the past 40, 50 years or so, there has developed in America several organizations that specialize in cherry-picking cases with the explicit goal of getting them to the Supreme Court. So the Bremerton case that we talked about, the praying football coach, is one of those cases. It was handpicked, it was fabricated to get to the Supreme Court, and the guy's lawyers literally lied to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court believed it. That's deeper detail than you want. A corollary to this is something called judge shopping. And there's a situation brewing right now. Well, before I get to that, one of the most famous cases of judge shopping recently was the mifepristone case that was, the abortion drug, that was specifically put in the district in Amarillo, Texas, where there's only one federal judge who is an extreme far-right Trump appointee, evangelical Christian, knowing that he would rule in their favor on this. But they're allowed to do this, apparently. There's another case, two cases coming down the pike right now, that have to do with Elon Musk and TwitX, let's call it that.
That's what I'm going to start calling Elon Musk.
And this has to do with this group of advertisers who pulled out of advertising on Twitter as it became X because of the hate speech and all that. And Elon Musk has sued them, saying they can't collaborate to do that. But that got shopped to a judge in North Texas who they knew would be favorable, who also has another Elon Musk case, who it turns out is an investor in Tesla. And he will not recuse himself from one of the cases. I'm wondering from our legal folks, is there any recourse here for this type of shopping these cases and just building them up in a way to bully your way through?
How much time you got?
Genuinely interested.
Well, there's like several different strands in there. The judge shopping part is going to require some reform, either by Congress or the Supreme Court, to set some rules about where cases have to be filed. There are some rules already in place, but they've been proved too elastic and too ineffective. And I will add that not only are these cases being shopped to the trial level judges, the district court judges, who they know will be favorable to an extreme, but then they also feed up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is also populated by extreme conservative judges. So it's ultimately for the Supreme Court, but through a path that is. So that's a real problem. The issue of recusal, where there's a conflict of interest, has been most famously brought up by the long and torturous path of Clarence Thomas, refusing to recuse from cases despite conflict of interest involving people who pay for his trips, issues in which his wife has been involved, and there are no rules for the Supreme Court requiring recusal that are enforceable in any way other than by the individual justice themselves. Lower court judges are subject to rules about recusal, and there is a mechanism by which those decisions can be challenged if a judge in the first instance refuses to recuse him or herself. More broadly, the problem of the federal judiciary populated by people who are politicians in robes, basically, is that it erodes the rule of law itself. If the judiciary is not a check on excesses in power, but instead is a rubber stamp for a certain political view, everything is lost. Because as Dr. Gushee was talking about, you have to have the mechanisms, the rules of the road of democracy operating in a healthy way. Otherwise, we don't have the protections against an authoritarian impulse or an authoritarian leader. And so that is the real concern. The fact that it's been made so much easier by loose recusal rules and by the ability of these groups to judge shop. Those are just markers. The fundamental problem is a judiciary that is so dangerously unwilling to do its job. And we saw most importantly in the Trump immunity case, in which the court essentially said, a president is immune from being able to be charged criminally for his or her acts almost entirely when they're in office. And the court tried to draw a distinction between official acts and non-official acts, but in ways that made a prosecution extraordinarily difficult. So across the whole landscape of what we expect and need from our judiciary, what we have seen from the Supreme Court on down is that we're not getting it.
Anyone else want to take a whack at that?
What Professor Marcosson said is so important. I just want you to think about it for a second. Okay. I mean, truly, it's that important, and I agree with it that much. Now, of course, you spoke in some self-interest. I will speak in some self-interest, too. I've co-sponsored 3 bills to impose ethical requirements and recusals on judges in the federal court system, so I think he's exactly right. We've got to do something. Why haven't we yet? Since the 1988 presidential election, Republicans have won the popular vote 1 time. They have 6 Supreme Court justices. They have populated the federal bench. There is 1 judge in Kentucky who was put on by a Democrat since Wendell Ford left the Senate. Right. This is intentional. And it's frustrating because if you look at the vote totals, it's not what America wants. But what I see from the Trump Republican Party today and going back a while is everything they say is projection or confession. And so when they were referring to liberal justices as activist judges, they were telegraphing exactly what they wanted to do with the judiciary. They've done it. And now it's going to be very, very difficult for Congress to take that away. And the only way it's possible, and think about this, Professor Marcosson said this, there are no ethics rules for the Supreme Court. There are for district court. There are for circuit court, court of appeals, but not for the Supreme Court. We can't even get that passed through Congress right now with the House Republican majority. So it's going to take getting people in the majority who believe that we should have our institutions working for the people, by the people, of the people. And it's going to be hard to reel some of this back in.
If I could just follow up on that, I do think one of the, David talked about the importance of separation of powers and checks and balances, and having rules of the road that apply to everybody if the democratic experiment is going to continue here. And I think that really is what all of this boils down to. I think judges have to be willing and have to be capable of ruling against their political friends and allies when neutral principles of law require it. And, I think that's what we have kind of lost in the last few years as the legal profession has become hyper partisan. And we've seen the emergence of these, legal groups that litigate cases, hot-button culture war cases in order to advance their political agenda. The federal court system certainly has not dealt with those cases very well, in my opinion, and I think it's lessened the respect for the rule of law that is so critical to making democracy work, And I will say, it's kind of ironic because I think these right-wing partisan legal organizations have tried to mimic the success of the civil rights movement and of litigation in the civil rights movement. But there's a very big difference, because most of the really important civil rights cases that were decided back in the 50s and 60s. They came out of the same Fifth Circuit that is now dominated by, Republican partisans. But in those cases, in many of those cases, you had Republican judges who were voting to uphold the rights of African American civil rights workers and voters in a way that really was adverse to the political interest of their friends and allies. And I don't think we're seeing any of that now, and I think that's a real danger for our judiciary if judges are not willing to rule against their political friends and allies on neutral principles of law.
And I'll just jump in to say that it really is the purview of the courts to protect and defend these most important principles in our democracy, our constitutional values, which is really the social compact we have about what it means to live and to be in America. And it creates this wonderful, welcoming, tolerant society that we all love. I'll give you an example of sort of when I realized, it's the courts. When I got into the Senate, there was a bill that we were about to pass, and I was like, this is clearly unconstitutional, just on its face, not even a question. So I did my research, I wrote out my notes, and I went to someone across the aisle, and I was like, see, you probably didn't know, but this is a very unconstitutional bill that you have here. Can't agree with me on these points. And the person was like, you're probably right. That's not our job. We pass good legislation and good policy ideas here, and courts strike it down if they want. And I'll tell you, it took me aback. I had this idea that if I went with sort of the right legal arguments, that somehow that was going to influence the policymaking process. And I still believe it probably should. But we've reached this place where a lot of policymaking is performative. It's people passing policies, even if they know they're unconstitutional, just to say these are what my values are. Maybe even if it violates the separation of church and state, maybe I don't think there should be a separation of church and state, so I'm going to pass this law so I can go back home and say I did that. I helped bring about these values. And so we really need our courts to do the job that they're supposed to be doing. And what we've seen is as they become more politicized, they're not necessarily capable of that in the same way.
I would underline and boldface that, absolutely.
Can I just say that this is a really good example of those deep principles that I was talking about, for example, recusal. Let's say you don't have adequately strong requirements of recusal. That means you're depending on the character of the judge and the judge's commitment to democratic norms. I better not rule on this case because it would threaten the appearance of impartiality, or it would not be appropriate for me to do so. Now, I think I could be fair. I might like to rule in this case, but I'm going to voluntarily refrain from doing so. In other words, that's what recusal should be, right? To the extent that you have to mandate everything and make binding ethics laws or rules, to that extent, you're already, in a sense, revealing that you don't trust the people anymore. The people are not being trustworthy. So you have to impose rules or laws. It's some combination of binding laws that provide checks on the abuse of power, but it's also norms. I think of myself as a professor. I have students under my authority every semester. There's all kinds of rules that govern my behavior. If I were to abuse my power over my students, there would be rules that would be relevant, but there's also a lot of norms. Norms. They're not quite as strong as rules, but they're like norms like fairness. Norms like kindness. You're not supposed to try to destroy a student. You're always supposed to try to be kind to your students. There are norms. If we don't have the norms, we can never come up with enough rules. If you have a normless person in a position of major authority, you'd be writing a rule every day to try to deal with whatever norm violation they were doing on a given day. Extreme partisanship can make people abandon norms other than the norm of winning. I fear that this is what has happened, for example, to Clarence Thomas. I don't know what he might once have been, but what he is now is a transparently corrupted partisan. And you would think that anybody committed to the health of our democracy, Republican or Democrat, would say to him, you've kind of crossed a line, let's get somebody else in. It's time for you to go. But no, it's a strategic seat, and so he hangs on. Democracy will die if we do not have people, both at the grassroots level and especially at the higher levels, who have the character and the commitment to the norms that make democracy work. You can't impose enough laws or rules to overcome that deficit, I think.
Okay, thank you all. I've got 2 more questions, just so you know. This is like the preacher saying, almost in conclusion, but not yet. Among the questions that people turned in from the audience, there was a theme of looking for hope. Dr. Gushee spoke in the end of his presentation about some things that could happen that would be helpful. And y'all have alluded to some of those, and I'm going to embellish on what he said. Gerrymandering, the Electoral College, Supreme Court ethics reform, all of these things we've been circling around, and gerrymandering, huge, huge issue we haven't even broached yet. And folks want to know, is there any hope for any of this ever being addressed, or are we terminally stuck with this? I mean, I think what David said was, we're at a point where some of our founding documents need to be amended. That's a paraphrase of that. Is that even realistic? Is there any hope?
Well, I'm going to speak in 2 voices on this. First, I'm going to speak in the law professor voice. Then I'm going to speak in a different voice. I'll describe in a minute. The law professor voice is, it's dark times and the light isn't coming on anytime soon. Because amending the Constitution in the ways that are critical is extraordinarily difficult, and especially difficult in polarized times when there's no consensus to reach the supermajorities. Forget majorities, the supermajorities you need for constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court has already held that partisan gerrymandering is perfectly okay, does not violate the Constitution under either the 14th or the First Amendments. So the problem of polarization that ends up being making gerrymandering even worse is not going to change. The Electoral College isn't going to change. The filibuster rules in the Senate may change, but be careful what you wish for, because if you change the filibuster rules in the Senate and make things easier for the Senate to pass, what happens when the Senate is led is in Republican hands at a time when the House is too? Because if there's no filibuster that the Democrats can use, all the things we've been talking about will be easier to have happen. So there's my gloom and doom side, the law professor side. Here's the more hopeful voice, and that's the voice of a gay man. The year I graduated from law school, which was a long time ago, I won't say when. No, it was 1986, was the year the Supreme Court decided Bowers against Hardwick, upholding the constitutionality of laws criminalizing sodomy between people of the same sex. And I graduated that year, almost as soon as I had graduated, that decision came down, and I was crestfallen. I thought, all of these values that I thought I was taught in law school, that I believed in, the court being a tool for progressive change, that I was not included in that, right? I was not included in the idea of equality, liberty, privacy, and it made me very cynical for a while. And it was very difficult to get over that. In my lifetime, that same Supreme Court overturned Bowers against Hardwick less than 2 decades later in Lawrence against Texas. And just 15 years later, less actually, they decided Obergefell, recognizing the equality and liberty of same-sex couples to marry. So change is possible. It takes time. It can restore cynicism or turn cynicism into faith. So we don't have to give up just because things may look dark right now and the light may not seem to be coming on anytime soon. So the lesson of that experience is look ahead to times that might be better.
Preach. So you go. You are a Baptist pastor, doom and gloom and hope in the same sphere. That was great. I do want to promote Dr. Brogdan's book, who talks about hope in the midst of social chaos. That is available on Amazon. It's really fabulous. But part of Dr. Gushie's book is Black Abolitionists. And really leaning into the work that has already been done and is being done in communities that have been oppressed for centuries. And I think it is a very critical lesson for people who are used to being the norm and the status quo and having the power to really lean into those who have had to find hope without bootstraps and bring it up and build up their communities and build up their institutions. And teaching at Simmons College African American history to students, African American students, they teach me about hope every day. And then preaching to African American pastors at BSK Theological Seminary teaches me about what churches are doing on a local level to continue to bring forth hope, even in areas that feel so hopeless. And so I really encourage you, particularly if you identify as a white person like I do, to find hope in the places that have been doing hope a lot longer than we have. That's my sermon.
Amen again.
I'll weigh in and feel a lot the way that Professor Marcosson does, particularly given that we are nearly 11 weeks out from the election. And this is a big one. And so, you're familiar with the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin when asked at the Constitutional Convention, "Sir, what type of government have you given us?" His response was, "A republic, if you can keep it." I like the way that Congressman David Obey from Wisconsin, and a wonderful Grateful Dead fan, said as he retired. He said, "Democracy does not guarantee a happy ending." And I think that is the gloom side. What you've heard in this is there are forces afoot today, not quietly. Again, look at Project 2025. Type Christian nationalism into your web browser when you go home and see what comes up. And you will see these are not quiet forces afoot to take hold and change the democracy that is the uniquely American experiment. But so far they're losing. And in 2016, when we elected Donald Trump, it was only 2 years later that we took control away in Congress, and 2 years after that we defeated Donald Trump, not only in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote. And then look at the legislation that passed. And everyone predicted, once you invest in infrastructure, and once you have a CHIPS and Science Act, and once you do responsible gun control, and once you invest in kids and working families and child care, there's going to be a huge Republican sweep in the midterm elections. It didn't happen. And so, I'm hopeful today because I think we are talking about this. We're getting these messages across in a real way. But we may be back here after the election, not in such a great shape. And so I think, the hope is we have come so far. As Professor Marcosson says, we have always been guided in this country by the idea of more perfect. The country was founded in irony, that all people are created equal. And we failed to live up to that. And when we freed slaves, we didn't free them, we fired them. And racism endured, and sexism endured. But we have gone towards more perfect, and we've always gone in that direction. And so I think you'll see a lot of people right now doing our part to continue that journey towards more perfect. But I think the gloom side is it is not guaranteed, and that there are active forces we have to fight against to keep it.
Beautiful.
That was a great one to end on, yeah.
So, having grown up Southern Baptist, I know when to give the altar call, and I think we're there. This turned into a question about hope, and I just want to give our other three panelists who didn't answer that any last words about hope. I just don't even want to ask another question after this. It was so good.
I would just say that often reactionary movements fail because they're just not all that appealing. They're about going backwards. They're about withdrawing equality and dignity and opportunity from people. And it's just not that attractive overall. And I think that's part of what we're seeing at this moment here on, August 17th? The crabby, backward-looking vision of one side of the electorate is just looking pretty small and unappealing. We're about turning the clock back to an earlier America in which fewer people had equality of opportunity and full dignity. Is that really a majority message? I don't think that it is. But part of the nuts and bolts we've been talking about is that some of the processes of our democracy and some of the people who have been put into place, they have disproportionate power to block the will of the majority that wants a multiracial, inclusive democracy where everybody is included in the covenant. So that's one reason why it's so touch and go. But in the end, I don't think that reactionary vision, I don't think it attracts many of our children. I don't think it attracts many of our grandchildren. They're used to a very different vision, and they like it, most of them. And they're not going back. So I don't know what the 2024 election, I don't know what will happen exactly, but I think on the whole, the cultural trends that were unleashed beginning in the 60s, women's equality and participation, civil rights, freedom for people to make life choices, racial inclusion, all of that, I don't know, I just don't think we're going back. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't ferociously committed minority on the other side that would like to go back. And I think that's where we find ourselves. In the end, I think that the reactionary movements, I don't think they can prevail in an equal vote. Yeah.
So my gloom and doom is when I think about a world where we all see each other as us versus them. And I think a lot of us live in that world right now with the 24-hour news cycle and consuming news that largely amplifies our own views and self-sorting based on political ideology or whatever other ideology that we might have that we can use to say that person's not on my team. And it can feel like that a lot. And I think that democracy doesn't survive if we get to that place. If we get to that place where it's always us versus them in the most extreme, most partisan, most angry ways, it's really hard for us to live up to our promise of an inclusive democracy based on the idea of disagreeing but not always doing it disagreeably, and agreeing that we all come together and respect the outcome of elections and respect the majority rule of democracy. What makes me hopeful is that most of the time in the world, when you get out from behind your screen and you go talk to people, that's not what the world feels like. When you go and you talk to someone, Congressman McGarvey and I are both UK basketball fans, I think I could talk to almost anyone in the state of Kentucky about UK basketball. And it'll take me at least an hour to find out what their political leanings are. And so it makes me hopeful that there are still these ways that we can connect to each other, even in times when it feels as though there's so much that separates us. And so I feel really hopeful about the future of our institutions and about the future of our community so long as we maintain that.
Thank you. Last word?
Well, I would just echo that, and I would say, if we want a more open and just and tolerant and inclusive society, we need to live those values in our own lives. We need to join with our friends and neighbors in our communities to promote those values, and ultimately, I think those are the values that are going to be successful in making this country a better place. So, and I do think that, with this question about, what about the legal system and what about the laws that are being passed and the punitive measures that are being taken against minority groups or whatever, in many ways the answer to that is that I do think that the law will follow the culture. And if we make our culture more accepting, more kind, more inclusive, more tolerant, the laws will ultimately change and the pendulum will swing back the other way. So I do think that that's something we really need to focus on, and I think David is exactly right.
Is that we're engaging in change-making conversations, and this certainly has been a change-making conversation here today. Thank you to Dr. Gushy for his leadership in all of this today. As we mentioned earlier, David is a columnist for B&G, and if you've read all of his 27 books already and you need some additional David literature, then come to baptistnews.com and check out his author page, and you'll find a whole lot of great stuff there. And I'm going to turn this back over to our host to say the final words.
Thanks to everyone who carved some time out for this important. Yeah. We appreciate you all so much. And I asked Jordan to come up just to reaffirm that Dr. Gushy will be preaching in the morning, and we expect to see.
There may be an actual altar call involved in that.
There might be.
Grady, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us today. It has been a wonderful gathering. As Grady said, we invite you all to join us tomorrow morning for worship at 10:45. Dr. Gush will be preaching for us tomorrow morning. Can we just express our gratitude once more to all of our panelists? Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Have a good night. Go in peace.